Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with two guests. Publisher of the journal Political Risk, Dr. Corr, who delves into two of his exclusive articles. One reveals just how much money U.S. investors have poured into China since 1992, a whopping $2.3 trillion. He sheds light on the moral and ethical concerns around that. And in his second piece, Corr expands on his exclusive interview with former director of the National Trade Council in the Trump administration, Peter Navarro, and the role in tariffs on China. And also joining us today, we have Director at Econ America's Fergus Hodson. He gives his take on the Cuba protests against communism. Let's dig in. Dr. Corr, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tiffany.
And so there's a new report with some pretty shocking claims that over $2.3 trillion has been invested into China since 1992. And these are huge investment companies in America and a lot of pension funds. And a lot of this data is very exclusive. So for those who are at home who don't have access to this data, how can they trust some of these numbers?
Well, the number is $2.3 trillion that U.S. investors, big companies, and also state pension funds and the like have invested in China. And we've known about this for a long time. I mean, you could simply Google how much money does various organizations and investors have in China, and you will find a lot of information. But this big headline number of $2.3 trillion is exclusive to Epoch Times. We have not published that before anywhere else. But it's the source of this is a government document that I procured, and it is. I have reproduced some of those data tables in PDF format directly from the government document, so that can be verified. And all of those numbers are public information on Bloomberg terminals. You can get that from Reuters terminals. Usually from subscription services, you'll find those numbers in there if you dig into that deeply enough. So it's all reproducible. It's ironclad, rock solid numbers.
And so some of these companies are really big names like BlackRock or JP Morgan and Chase. So what are some of the findings you found?
Yeah, BlackRock is the biggest investor in that data set that data set alleges is heavily invested in China. A lot of the investments are actually from various companies are actually in prescribed some entity list companies in China, companies that have military links, companies that are doing military projects. So a lot of it's really questionable.
So you mentioned BlackRock as one of the biggest names, and according to the graph in the article from the government analysis, which we will show on screen, it found that BlackRock invested more than $155 billion in more than 1,500 securities. JP Morgan Chase has more than $140 billion invested in Chinese entities, and Vanguard Group has more than $130 billion invested. So with these, what are some of the concerns?
Well, I think that the more that this data is coming out, actually, the more Wall Street is questioning, I believe, some of their investments and whether these investments can keep going without crashing. Just this last week, the Shanghai stock index has dropped over 6%, which is a really big drop. I think that the investors are getting very jittery about China at this point. They're a bit worried because of that drop, this week's drop, and you actually do see in the news quite a bit now some concerns. There's a Yale professor, economist, who's recently is basically shocked. He said, "I've always been, I've always been a believer in investing in China, but even he now, this Professor Stephen Roach at Yale, is questioning whether it's wise to invest in China anymore." He actually called it the beginning of a Cold War with China. And if you have a Cold War happening with a country, that's not a country that it's safe to invest in because the government can take your investments in 2 seconds. And we've seen that the Chinese Communist Party has no qualms about taking DiDi apart, taking Jack Ma apart, Ant Financial, Alibaba. These are small companies to them. They're little ants to be squished for the Chinese Communist Party. They really don't care if you're a billionaire or a multimillionaire. They will take your money if they can, or if they deem that it's good for the party.
And so another concern that a lot of people are pointing out is ethical and moral concerns, because a lot of people are saying by investing in China, it's in a way supporting that kind of government. And the U.S. is very hard on human rights abusers, and China is known as a human rights abuser. So a lot of people are saying there's a conflict of interest. And what do you make of that?
I absolutely agree. I think that actually I also interviewed Peter Navarro recently, and he basically alleged that the reason why the U.S. government, in particular the Treasury Department, is so soft on China is because Wall Street, quote, has its hooks in the Treasury Secretary, and that's both Janet Yellen and the former Secretary Mnuchin. Navarro, in the interview which I had with him, which was exclusive, basically, he said that the quote Wall Street trash, unquote, and the Goldman Sachs trash are overly affecting our government, and that's a real problem. So this is one of the reasons why, while the American people have a real belief in human rights and democracy, sometimes our government is not taking action on that as strongly as they do promoting U.S. trade in China or promoting U.S. investments in China, because the most influential powers, Wall Street and Treasury Department, are not as focused on human rights and on democracy issues, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the like, as are the American people.
And some are also raising the issue that a lot of Americans might think, oh, this has nothing to do with me, right? But then there's been a lot of reports coming out that a lot of these are, say, the thrift savings plan. These are federal government officials whose pension funds are basically investing in what they've been standing against in their whole careers. And so these are some issues that are coming to light. But what are some ways you think Americans can learn more about these?
You've raised the ethics issue, and it's absolutely true. If you're putting your money in China, then what China does is in part your responsibility too. So it's all of our responsibility, really, as investors, to insist that we get our money out of China, and also to insist that our government representatives, our congressmen and our congresswomen, senators, that they pass legislation to further constrict the supply of capital to China, because that capital is what is powering China to do what they do. That's giving them the money to build their Navy, to build actually nuclear missiles that are targeting Washington, D.C., New York. So it's absolutely wrong that we are putting money into a country that is so belligerent and so threatening, not only to us, but to our allies in Asia, Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia. All these countries have been threatened or attempted coerced economically from Beijing. So it's a real danger. It's a real problem. And the U.S. and Europe, let's not let Europe off the hook. We all need to pull our money back from China and rethink how we deal with this growing potentially hegemonic power.
And as you mentioned, a lot of countries need to find ways to kind of pull away from the China market. So what are some of the ways they could do that?
Well, countries need to pass legislation, because not all investors are going to do this voluntarily. And the legislation that needs to be passed is increasing the sanctions, increasing export controls on anything going to China. And we also need to think about protecting some of our industries, that are strategic. So we saw during the pandemic that there were limitations on ventilators, that there was difficult to get PPE because we weren't producing them in the U.S. We were relying on China. What's crazy is that even some of our military hardware, our fifth-generation fighter jets, rely on some parts from China. We're hugely reliant on China for manufacturing chips, computer chips. We're also reliant on a lot of Asian countries for that. Also, our shipping industry. We build a lot of the big ships are built, big cargo ships, tankers are built in China. So there's a real danger that if there's an emergency, if another pandemic comes along, if there's a war or something like that, we're not going to have the things that we need to survive as a nation because they're all being produced in China or in countries near China that it would be difficult for us to ship from in an emergency. So we really need to think as a country about reshoring some of our industries back into the United States. And this is something that Peter Navarro, of course, the economist under Trump, was promoting. He was promoting this idea of economic security is national security. President Biden is not entirely getting rid of Trump's tariffs, which is on China, which is a very good thing. We need some tariffs in place, both to punish China and to try to encourage China to do what's right and to change course away from attempting to be this global hegemon. But we also need those tariffs to protect some of our most important strategic industries like steel, aluminum, PPE, ventilators, whatever you need, even chip manufacturers, computer chip manufacturers. We need to bring some of that back and make sure that we are, we're self-reliant on the most important strategic goods.
And so China is a centrally planned economy, which means all the proceeds and basically funds the state. And so a lot of these investing in China then by proxy is also investing in the state. And so a lot of people are raising concerns about funding a communist regime. And that's also been seen with Cuba, where they reversed that by putting a complete trade embargo in place. And so a lot of people now are raising the question about, is that embargo good? Because now a lot of people are raising the concern that, it's because of the U.S. sanctions that what's happening in Cuba is happening. So what's your take on that?
Well, the embargo is a good thing. It's in place to encourage the country to become a democracy. Currently, it's a dictatorship. They have no human rights. People can't vote. They don't have freedom of speech. It's a real problem. The protests are against communism. We want those protests to essentially bring democracy to the country. That's often how democracies happen. Is there are people in the streets. They protest for democracy. They protest for freedom. And it's something that we could potentially see in China someday if we decouple from China, if we impose embargoes and tariffs on China, then maybe someday the Chinese people say, hey, maybe maybe our system isn't ideal. Maybe we do need a democracy. We never would have predicted that the Soviet Union under Gorbachev would switch into a democracy, but it did. And so sometimes it comes from the most surprising places. So I hope that we see such a peaceful transition in China someday.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Great to meet you.
So welcome, Fergus Hodson. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So there's been some contrast between China and Cuba recently because they're both centrally planned economies, and a lot of people are noting the sanctions on them. There's sanctions on China, but there's a complete trade embargo on Cuba. And a lot of media and BLM, Black Lives Matter in particular, has been blaming the current political protests against the communist regime in Cuba on these sanctions, calling them inhumane. So what's your take on that?
Maybe the key difference is that in Cuba, there still is essentially zero private incorporation or private business growth. What exists in the private sector is really just people working as low-skilled laborers and some accommodation. So if you go through Airbnb or something like that, people can rent out a room. So it's an extremely micro scale of economic activity. So any larger operation has to be a cooperative with the military regime. So I guess the difference might be that the Cubans have been willing to keep the country poor for so much longer. what I fear people don't realize is that the people in power in Cuba are quite willing, they are willing to let just Cubans in general be extremely poor and just continue on. And it did not end the regime, they just kept in power. So the notion that we're going to just starve them out of power, it's just not going to work. Now, that lack of economic clout has meant that Cuba really is insignificant on the world stage. So China actually has been smart about this and allowed, you could say, this managed development. So where there's some economic development, but still the state has a tight rein on what's going on. Whereas in Cuba, it's just almost suffocated. It's very limited. That's why even if there were no trade embargo, they would have no money to buy anything. So it would be almost irrelevant. Yeah, so the problem is not the sanctions or the embargo, which has been in place for more than half a century. The problem is a communist economy or a Soviet economy that has no productivity, cannot afford to buy anything. If they actually produced anything, they could trade with every country on the planet except Israel and the United States. And so there's a great open door for them to engage in trade. The embargo has simply been a scapegoat for the regime. The embargo was deserved. They confiscated private property, private industry, and therefore there were sanctions put on them. If you go to Havana, there is a major billboard saying bloqueo, the greatest genocide in history, which is just a lie, but it reflects the scapegoating that the regime there has used. The fact is they will not grow unless they liberalize the economy, and the regime does not want to do that. And right now, the middle class in Cuba is really people who have left to go to Miami and those who are enjoying the remittances sent to them.
And so some of the issues seems to be where this money is going if other countries are sending aid to Cuba. President Biden mentioned recently the issue is not to enable the regime more, but to really help the Cuban people. So what would you say about that?
No, that's a great concern, and that's why many, if not all, of the Cuban exiles are reluctant to go back, because they know whenever they go back, immediately when you convert U.S. dollars to the pesos, you'll be paying a commission to the regime, and whenever you go and stay at a hotel or whatever, the lion's share of any money will go to the regime and not to the people. So this is a grave problem that any engagement with the Cuban economy, basically by definition, because there are no private corporations there are only partnerships with the regime, must go to the regime. And if you don't want them to get any money, well, you basically have to stay away or not engage. So it's a very difficult situation. There are other ways to build pressure. Sending money directly is not really going to solve the crisis, though.
So what are some ways, say, Americans can help the Cuban people right now?
Great question, because for the longest time, many people have viewed Fidel Castro, who's now passed away, as some sort of Robin Hood figure. And even one of the party leaders up in Canada, Jagmeet Singh of the NDP, praised Fidel Castro after his death, which is absurd. So the regime has invested heavily in building a veneer of legitimacy. And so just being more aware that this is a nation of lies or a regime of lies and sharing that view, it has an impact. They do care about their image. They realize that they want international support. They want engagement. And right now, the United States is the main ideological rival to the communist regime. The regime does send, for example, medical staff to other countries to basically profit from them. So just being aware of what's going on in Cuba, and I hate to say it, but just engaging with the media that is aware of this, such as your own network, is a wonderful start.
And so there seems to be some confusion around what these protests are actually about. There's a lot of media, Twitter, for instance, saying it's about COVID vaccine shortages, a lack of food. But what ultimately are these Cuban people protesting?
Yeah, so if you go to the island, it is basically a prison island. And many exiles will say, todos son presos, which means they're all prisoners. So that is what people are fighting against. The problem is many decades of dictatorship, keeping people making about $20 per month, struggling to survive. It's inhumane. It is demoralizing to survive on mere rations. But the current issues of vaccines or food are really just superficial relative to the longer term substantive problems.
So it sounds like in a way these people are fighting for their freedom and democracy. Is that true?
Yes and no, because the truth is many of them don't even know what that is. They've never grown up with it, right? So I was just thinking this morning about the Bay of Pigs fiasco and how I've met many veterans from that era, and they will just say that 2 generations of people in Cuba have now grown up and they don't know what democracy is. They have a sense that there's this opportunity, this wealth over there, there's something better there. But in terms of a rich understanding of what civil liberties may be, that's just hard to observe. But to assume that the general public have a sense for democracy, they just don't. They've lived under a one-party state for more than half a century.
And you also mentioned that many of the Cubans protesting right now haven't experienced or even know what democracy is. So what would be some ways of, say, helping the island going forward?
Well, there's a great book on this called Mañana in Cuba by Jose Azell. He recommends, obviously there's a long-term educational process, and in Miami, when exiles leave and come to the United States, they go through basically a training period to understand what is a free society all about, how do I take responsibility for my own finances and my economic resources. So, but there would have to be some sort of, he calls it libertarian paternalism or a soft paternalism, where you'd have to in some ways nudge people towards a free market and educate them more than you would in a naturally free society, because you're basically having to transition away from it. It would not be an easy task, and the longer you have a communist regime in place, it's almost like anthropological damage. You've done irreversible damage to the psyche and pride of a nation of people, and that just does not reverse quickly. It's going to take decades. And right now, to be frank, Venezuela is going through that same process where people are living decades under dictatorship and will grow up not knowing what a free society is all about. The U.S. is the ideological rival to Cuba, and we should protect that. And I often am sad that maybe 50 years ago, the U.S. would have been a much stronger rival and would have been more combative. And I want the U.S. to keep that mantle, to keep fighting against the communist expansion around the world.
Well, Fergus, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tiffany.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with publisher of the journal Political Risk, Dr. Anders Corr, and director at Econ America's Fergus Hodson. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.